All right, Psalm 10, let's call this when God has established his throne for justice over the entitled, as we look at the ways in which wrongdoing unchecked can begin to feel like a right. In this chapter, where David is going to start out by saying, why does God stand so far away from us in times of difficulty, especially in times when the wicked in arrogance hotly chase the poor? David is going to say it's not simply them creeping around or in some form of shame or apprehension chasing the poor. They've built up momentum. As we mentioned before, it's the kind of momentum that can be built up when wrongdoing has gone unchecked. As David is going to go on to say that they, in addition, boast of their ambitions. They have grown greedy for more and more, and they're succeeding seemingly at every turn. But as David is going to say, in fixating on those ambitions, God's judgments have grown distant on high and out of their sights. As David describes the ways in which they believe that in all generations, their reign will never come to an end, and moreover, they will never see adversity. Beyond that, David describes the way in which their mouth utters cursing, deceit, oppression, mischief, and iniquity, as their modus operandi is to set up ambushes to murder the innocent or to ensnare the poor and unsuspecting. Basically going on to say that their reward, or the expected reward for all of this, is a pass from God, believing that God has either forgotten or hidden his face, a term that the word uses in times when God has observed so much iniquity or wrongdoing in a situation that he turns away from those he would have otherwise protected, suggesting that in this circumstance, the wicked are using that as an opportunity to simply do whatever they want, believing or telling themselves that those who they are victimizing deserve it. However, David is going to take a shift in verse 14 where he is going to say, but you do see, asking God to intervene, and to not only intervene, but to break the momentum of those who have begun to assume that they are entitled, because God will never hold them accountable. And moreover, he is not only going to ask God to intervene, he is going to ask him to intervene until there are none left. And in the last verse, he is going to say, so that man who is of the earth may strike terror no more. Once again, David knowing well the long period of waiting that goes along with taking refuge in God and waiting on him to resolve an unjust situation. But he also knows the way in which God can completely subdue his enemies, understanding that when God put an end to the injustice done to David, he brought it to a complete end. And so David is quite qualified to encourage us to take refuge in God and wait for him to act until he puts a complete end to the injustice done to us. But one of the things that caught my attention is the degree to which much of what is going on with the wicked in this chapter is going on in their heart, where 3 times we're going to see, one in verse 6, he says, in his heart, I shall not be moved throughout all generations. I shall not meet adversity. In verse 11, it's going to say, he says, in his heart, God has forgotten. He has hidden his face. He will never see it. And in verse 13, why does the wicked renounce God and say, in his heart, you will not call to account? Reminding me of this. From time to time, I lament the whole issue of cheap grace, understanding that outwardly David is leaving room for these to be people of God, people who outwardly project a decent image. As in later chapters this week, he is going to describe the way in which flattery is a tool of the wicked. Here he's describing the way in which no matter what they present on the outside, inwardly they have even more disturbing ambitions than those they would share publicly. And the reason cheap grace came to mind is it's a term that was coined a few years back to describe the perversion of grace that we've seen recently, whereas grace is a biblical thing. Now what's happened is we've watered it down to basically provide a covering or an excuse for anything we would want to do. And that seems to be the level of entitlement we're looking at in this chapter, where the psalmist is describing people who have grown entitled to do wrong because they don't feel that God will hold them accountable. Therefore, if they need any excuse, the excuse they need is, he's so magnificent that his grace is sufficient to cover pretty much whatever I'd like to do. And in contrast to the kind of grace that the Bible actually describes, that's cheap grace. It's the kind of grace that is rooted in a sense of entitlement to forgiveness that God has never promised.